Hello, welcome back. My name is Andy and we are talking about ancient Greece. This is a series of lectures where we go into the history and philosophy of ancient Greece, and we will talk primarily about philosophy, about the Presocratics, about the classic period of ancient Greek philosophy, all the famous people, Plato, Aristotle, and then also the late Greek philosophy, Stoicism, Epicureanism, what later also became Roman philosophy to some extent, Latin philosophy, and how it all ended. This is a long series of lectures about all these aspects of ancient Greek philosophy. I hope you enjoy this. Last time we talked generally about the ancient Greek world, about its political organization, and we started looking at a timeline. So ancient Greek philosophy begins at 585 BC, not in the ancient Greek world, right? Only ancient Greek philosophy proper or science. The ancient Greek world is much older. Of course, we have the empires that are mentioned in Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and these were much, much earlier. These were another 500, 600, 700 years earlier. So the Greek philosophy and the Greek science begins conventionally at 585 BC, where Thales predicted a solar eclipse. As we said last time, solar eclipses are easy to calculate today. We know when it happened precisely because they happen regularly and we can simulate the process and find out when they actually really happened. And it ends in 529 AD after Christ, when the Christian Emperor Justinian in Rome outlawed the teaching of pagan philosophy and tried to turn, the whole intellectual world Christian. And so we have about 1,000 years of ancient Greek philosophy. And this is also important to realize. Often when you talk about these ancient Greek times, people concentrate on this 5th century BC, the Golden Era, and the Peloponnesian War that ended it. But this is not only ancient Greece. Ancient Greece, really, and ancient Greek philosophy is a 1,000-year-long enterprise. It lasted as long as from the High Middle Ages to today, right? This is 1,000 years. So from the year 1000 to the year 2000, the same thing from the year 500 before Christ to 500 after Christ. It is a huge period. It is a very long period in which a lot of things happened that are very interesting and we will talk about here. And so it is not only a few years, and it's not only Athens, it's many different places in which this developed. Okay, so before we begin with the ancient Greek world philosophy, we have mythological explanations of the world. This is the first stage when the Greeks started thinking, how did the world come about? What makes it work? What controls it? And this is roughly before 600. Conventionally, we would say before 625. But again, these very precise dates are mostly silly, right? Because, of course, it's not one point in time where this changes. But in these pre-classic times, in these mythological times, we have primarily the works of Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and of Hesiod, who wrote a cosmogony, a history of how the world was created by the gods and what the gods did. And this was for the ancient Greeks a standard work, a standard piece of knowledge about the creation of the world that they probably saw like we do the Bible. They were aware that this is a kind of a mythical story, a mythical explanation, but it was very influential to them and it formed their self-understanding, it formed their identity because they identified with these stories. They believed in these gods, even if they did not all, believe in the same way. Like today, we are not all Christians who literally believe in the truth of the Bible, but we still identify as, let's say, a Christian in a loose sense, a Christian cultural space in which West Europe and North America exist. And in this way, the cultural space of ancient Greece would have been shaped by Hesiod, by the classic gods, the 12 gods of ancient Greece, and the many other, associated gods and deities and demigods and then, of course, the stories from Homer. Now, after this comes Thales, 525, with the prediction of the eclipse, and then we enter what is called the pre-Socratic period. Pre-Socratic because, as an abbreviation, it comes before Socrates. And what did Socrates do? And primarily, Plato, who was the student of Socrates, they changed what philosophy was focusing on. In this pre-Socratic period, philosophy was focused on more scientific questions about what we today would call, perhaps physics or cosmology. Where does the world come from? What is it made of? What is the ultimate substance that keeps the world together? Is it atoms? Is it fire? How does it work? How does this whole construction of the world work? What are the stars? How was the earth created? What is the sun? How far away is it? Astronomy. So all these questions were very interesting to the pre-Socratic philosophers. And then also questions about the metaphysics of things, like how is movement possible? When we look at something, and today we have a very good way to verify this thought. It's a very interesting thought, that when you take a movie of something with your phone and you look at the individual frames of this movie, then you see that in each individual frame, the objects in this frame are static. They are not moving. And the more frames you take, the more static they are. So if you have a very high frame rate, even a flying bullet is nothing but a standing bullet, a standing bullet, a standing bullet, right? It never actually flies. And so some ancient Greek philosophers had this idea already, without, of course, having high-speed cameras, but they had this idea. What if I look at processes, at things that move, and at every moment I look at them, they are actually standing and not moving. So where does the moving actually happen? And this is really a great mystery. And it is something that today we experience all the time when we look at our digital photographs, right? Everything on a photograph is static. Nothing is moving. So when does it actually move? And we have lost today a little bit this capacity for wonder, right? The capacity to ask this question. Why does it move? When does it move? Where is the movement happening? I can never see it. And the more closely I look, the more it disappears. The higher my frame rate, the less things move. So where does it happen? And it's interesting that today we don't even ask this question. We cannot answer it. You cannot answer it, I'm sure. I cannot answer it. But it doesn't even occur to us that this is a question. And this is why the ancient Greeks are so fascinating, because for them, this was a question. This was something they saw and that puzzled them. How does this work? How can things even move? And if they cannot move, perhaps we should be honest enough and say they don't move. We are all mistaken. Movement is an illusion. Things never move. And if things never move, perhaps there is no time and perhaps there is no space in which they could move. So our whole world is perhaps just a dream, and in reality things don't move. There is no time, there is no space. It sounds paradoxical, it sounds crazy to us, but you have to see how logical this is from the perspective of people who just look at their world and they wonder and they try to be honest about it, and they just cannot tell how things work. And so this is the amazing thing about Greek philosophy, especially the pre-Socratic philosophy, that you have people asking these questions and then honestly trying to get to grips with them. And, most of the time, of course, failing because they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the instruments, they don't have, 2 millennia of science that we have that allows us to give somewhat better explanations to some of these processes, but not all of them. And if we are honest today, we still don't know why things move or when they move. And we don't know what gravity is, for example, right? Gravity, you drop something, it falls to the floor. Everybody has this experience, but we still don't really know what gravity is and how it works, the nature of gravity. It's we get out of the problem by saying it's an element of force, of nature. But it being a force of nature just means, we cannot explain it. We'll just say it's there. and we don't know where it comes from or why it works or how it works exactly. And so yeah, you see these questions of the Presocratics are still with us. They are still there. They are still very influential. And so the Presocratics, you already notice if you paid attention that there are two different groups of them, right? There are these people who care about the natural world, and these are mostly concentrated around what today is the Turkish coast, a city that back then was called Miletus, and a city nearby called Ephesus. So these are centers of this pre-Socratic philosophy that focuses on natural phenomena, on the question, what is the world made of, how does it work? And then you have the other part of pre-Socratic philosophy that focuses more on metaphysics and on these riddles. How is movement possible? Is there space? Is there time? How do these things work? And often they used riddles to puzzle people and to make them think. And perhaps you've heard of Achilles and the tortoise, where the tortoise is going very slowly, and Achilles is a very fast hero, and he will never be able to overtake the tortoise. And then there's philosopher Zeno who proves that this is impossible, that Achilles runs faster than a tortoise. And so this is a paradox that is supposed to make you think about your preconceptions about the world and so on. And these philosophers were concentrated mostly in a place called Elea, and Elea was in the south of Italy. And so you have, interestingly, the center of the Greek world being mainland Greece and mostly Athens, and later in a military sense Sparta, and then a few islands around them. And this was the political center, but the philosophical center was first Miletus, very far in the east, almost at the end of the Greek world. There were already the Persians were living there, and from time to time occupying these cities that were there, Ephesus, for example. And then on the other side of the Mediterranean, on the western end of the Greek world, you had Elea, where these other philosophers were. And then the third phase of ancient Greek philosophy, when the pre-Socratic phase ended, and then Plato and Socrates came and changed the direction of philosophy. This happened in Athens, and this is then what we call the golden time, the golden era, the golden century of ancient Greek culture, the 5th century BC, where these three philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, live in Athens and develop their philosophies there. And now, why is this a change? Because Socrates and Plato are not so much interested in these cosmological questions, what is the world made of, or these metaphysical puzzles. They still talk about them, but this is not their primary interest. Their primary interest are human beings, concerns of humans, human life, human morality, for example. What is a good action? What's a bad action? Human religious beliefs. What does it mean to believe in God? What does it mean to be pious, to obey gods? And is it always good to obey gods or not? Other questions like, what is a good society? What is a just society? What is a good government? How should we treat other people? And all these are questions that have to do with human being, with human life, with relationships. What is love, for example? What is friendship? Both Plato and Aristotle had books about friendship, about love, and also, of course, about ethics, about human knowledge. What do we know? How do we know things? So philosophy then becomes much more focused on human affairs and human interests and also human abilities, something like what we today call epistemology. How can we even know things? When I see, let's say, a tree outside, how do I know that this is a tree? How do I recognize a tree? This is not so trivial as it seems, right? Because all the trees look different. So how do I know that all these different things are tree? And this is something that puzzled Plato. And so Plato came up with a theory why all these things are recognized by us as trees. And of course, another thing also, what happens with us after death. So this always was interesting to human beings. Most of the time it is dealt with by religion because we don't have, many scientific ways of dealing with it. Even today, there is no successful scientific approach towards death. We can research moments close to death, but beyond actual death, it's impossible to go with science, so it's still a matter of belief, whatever happens after death to you. And this was also for the ancient Greeks, but it puzzled them. And it puzzled not so much the Presocratics, but Plato, who then has a theory of the soul and what the soul does after death. And this became very influential for Christian philosophy. The Christians later took these same ideas and developed them into Christian philosophy. And so this is another thing you will notice throughout this course, that very much of ancient philosophy ended up in Christian philosophy. So much that you can even say Christian philosophy is a reformulation of ancient Greek ideas, right? Almost everything in Christian philosophy, the idea of paradise, the idea of a perfect world that is only available to God, the idea of the soul having to do exercise, spiritual exercises in order to become closer to God, in order to approach God, the idea that God has perfect knowledge of the world, the idea that the universe is as a whole controlled by some spiritual force that is logical and that is creating the world through the word, what we have in the Gospel of John, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and so on. And these are things that all come from ancient Greek philosophy, in this case from Heraclitus, among other thinkers. And it is very important also to realize that this also historically, we know that the late philosophers of the ancient world and the early medieval philosophers were influenced by ancient Greek philosophy when they created Christian philosophy, Augustine, for example, and later, of course, Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest Christian philosopher, took a lot of ideas from Plato and Aristotle. And so Plato and Aristotle really also form the basis of much of Christian thought. And this is not, it's not disrespectful to Christianity or anything. Christianity is rooted in a historical development. It's not something that just falls from the sky, and on your head like a crazy hat. But it is a historical process. Jesus was a human being, lived at a particular time, and was influenced. His disciples were influenced. They were Greeks. They spoke Greek. Not Jesus himself, but many of his disciples, many of the apostles were Greek people. And they are rooted in this world, and they use the knowledge of their time, they use the books of their time in order to explain their philosophy. This is not something that we need to question, just because we want to be good Christians. This does not say anything about, the existence of God or anything. I just want to say it because you might think that I'm now trying to reduce, Christianity to just a copy of ancient Greek philosophy. That's not the case. But it was influenced by the ancient Greeks in the same way, perhaps, like you see it's interesting when you see, Christianity, how it is adapted in other cultures, right? You go to Africa, you have a church, and Christ there would sometimes be depicted as a black man, which is understandable because the people who relate to this religion and to these stories imagine people like themselves. They imagine people as black because they are black. And when you see Chinese depictions of Jesus and Mary, they often look Chinese, because it's natural. Why would you put a God image there that looks different from the people to which they cannot relate, right? You want people to relate to the image. And so in the same way, these first apostles tried to make Jesus and the message of Christianity relatable to the people they were talking to. And since these were mostly ancient Greeks or people influenced by ancient Greece, they talked in the words that these people would understand and that would make sense to them. And so this is why they would be talking to them in ancient Greek terms. Okay, and so then we have, after the classic period, which again is Socrates, his pupil Plato, and his pupil Aristotle. So it's a sequence of three people, of whom each was the teacher of the next one. We come to the late Greek philosophy, and this later Greek philosophy already blends with the Romans, with Roman philosophy. And so there in this late period, after the classic period, we find Epicureanism, Stoicism, and other philosophies that later Neoplatonism slowly developed towards the philosophy of the Middle Ages. And these late Greek philosophies are even more concentrated on human affairs. They use also the physical philosophy of the ancient times. So, for example, Epicureans and Stoics have science behind them. They believe, for example, in atomic theory. They believe that the world is made of atoms, but they don't focus on that. They just use these theories in order to make their point, which is how we should live in order to be happy. So these late Greek philosophers focus on the question of human happiness. And this in history is perhaps understandable, because the more we go towards the end of the Roman Empire, the lives of people become more difficult. The old empires fall apart. Ancient Greece is occupied, first destroys itself in the Peloponnesian War, and then is occupied by the Romans. Rome is occupied by the barbarians, and the times turn more and more violent. The classic buildings, the classic roads, the classic infrastructure start to decay and disappear, and the world becomes poorer, darker, less easy to navigate, more violent. Knowledge disappears, and also this sense of being part of a community of ancient Greeks that is safe and that is confident in its own abilities, all this starts to crumble and to disappear. And in this climate, it becomes more important to people to have philosophies that help them navigate these uncertain times. Like in today, we have a similar situation in which we had, like a century back, the 20th century was mostly, despite its problems, was mostly a confident century in which we did many things. We developed, modern medicine, antibiotics, flew to the moon, had the science fiction visions of a very good world, Star Trek, an ideal world, a paradise in which we would live free of concerns of material problems. And all this disappeared now, right? We live now in a world where we are threatened by wars, by dictatorships, by the retreat of democracy, by poverty, by migration, by climate change, by species extinction. And we try to navigate these catastrophic times in some way. And this is why people try to find again solace and meaning in religion, which has a huge uptake in Western countries, in the United States, that become more and more fundamentally religious, in racist ideologies, in closing the borders and isolating ourselves. These are all signs of stress that societies try to close down and to guard whatever they have and not share it with others in the same way like they did throughout the 20th century, when it was easier to share because there was more available to the Western world that they could share without losing much. And so also today you have again the resurgence of Stoicism, all these modern forms of Stoicism, Stoicism for business leaders, Stoicism for poor people, Stoicism for whatever you want, you can put there, right? Probably there's a book about Stoicism for bakeries. These are all signs of a stressed world in which we try to find meaning. And in this way, we are very similar to the late Romans, who saw their world in danger and try to find some philosophy to console them and give their lives meaning. So this was now an overview of the main ideas of ancient Greek philosophy from the Presocratics to the Roman times. And we will stop here to not make this too long again. And next time we will talk more about the Greek world, about Greek philosophy, and about the beginnings of the Presocratics in Elea and Miletus. Thank you and see you then. Bye bye.